Ian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric.
So, as we do with all our guests, let's just kick this off by having you introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
My name is Ian Blessing, and I have been working in the restaurant industry for the past 15 years or so. Every style and shape of restaurant, from fast casual to fine dining to full service to wine country casual, eventually leading up to my time as a sommelier at the French Laundry for a few years. And eventually decided to quit drinking along with my wife, Carly. And that led into and transitioned to what we're doing today, which is creating a line of alcohol-free cocktail bitters.
Wonderful. Yeah, we have a few bottles that we're going to taste along our audio journey today. And we're coming to this at a pretty exciting time because, as I understand it, you're just about to launch this brand. Is that right?
We are. Next week, actually, the website and online store will finally officially go live after many, many months of trying to get this up and running.
Awesome, man. Well, congratulations. I know all the work that goes into that. So if anyone's joining us on the live stream, that'll be next week. And if you're listening to this on the RSS feed, then we will give you all of the links and locations where you can go to check out the selection and order your bottle. But I wanted to dig in because, to me, I've always thought of bitters in particular as being a culinary thing. I had a grandfather who was a chef. I didn't really get into cooking and or flavor while he was still around, and I didn't really get to spend too much time in that space. But definitely the reason why I wanted to get into the cocktail world is because I had some really interesting experiences in restaurants in the service industry. And I wondered if you might speak a little bit more about the wine country casual, which is a descriptor or a category that I hadn't encountered before. And then, of course, you dropped a big name, which is the French Laundry. So I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what kind of cooking and what kind of flavor manipulation and experimentation you were doing in those settings that might have set you up for this brand.
Sure. So I'll start with wine country casual. When I moved from Southern California to Sonoma, I had just gotten into wine and really quickly became fascinated and obsessed with the culture of wine, the flavors, the experience, the stories, the people, the history. I've never been a history guy, but for some reason, diving into the history and the places and the geography of wine really, really resonated with me, really connected. I think part of the reason was because you got to drink while you did it, which always makes things more fun, to a certain point, and I'm sure we'll get more into that later on. But I decided to move to Sonoma, and I was working in a restaurant called The Girl and the Fig, which is a pretty kind of popular local touristy destination in Sonoma. It was really my first experience with more elevated cuisine. I had come from great restaurants, but places like the Cheesecake Factory, where I learned an incredible amount. I can't overstate the importance of restaurants like that and what I learned there. But this was really my first time pronouncing a single French word ever. I think the most exotic I got was a jambalaya. This was my first time with classic culinary techniques, with terms, with sauces, with preparations, with the history of food. And so I went from diving into, and I had always been interested in beverage. I had always loved beer and spirits and the history and stories behind them. But this was really my first time learning more about the history of food. And it was a great place. It was a great introduction to that world because it was a little more casual. It wasn't fine dining. People are in Sonoma to have a good time. You're doing some tastings during the day. You stop by for a flounder and a glass of wine. And it was a really interesting, again, introduction to wine for me, because the wine list is a little eccentric. It's only Rhone varietals. So a lot of California Rhone varietals: Syrah, Grenache, Mourvedre, Roussanne, Marsanne, Picpoul, my favorite. So I got to really dive deep into the Rhone Valley, both in France and California. But that restaurant was a great introduction for me, and really opened my eyes to food on a greater level. That then eventually led to the French Laundry. And I think one of the reasons why I got hired at the Girl in the Fig, when I started there, the owner asked me, she said, "We're not the French Laundry." And I said, "What's the French Laundry?" I had literally never heard of the restaurant before in my life. I had just picked up a book on wine. I had just gotten into wine. I had no idea. And she said, after I said, "What's the French Laundry?" She said, "You're hired." Funny enough, a few years later, I applied for a job at the French Laundry. So it was an interesting transition for me to go from wine country casual to wine country fine dining, and to the best in the world, and the highest class in the world. And for me to go from knowing very little about wine, a few years prior, and really diving into it, to really lucking out and being able to secure an interview and a second interview, and somehow get a job, and work my way up to the wine team. But to come back to it briefly, the culinary impact of bitters, and as you mentioned earlier, bitters are not only rooted in cocktails and drinks, but they do have such an amazing culinary component to them. The breadth and the spectrum of flavors that you can find in bitters. And for me, one of my favorite analogies and ways of explaining cocktail bitters to people that don't quite understand them is they're the spice rack of the bar. It's salt and pepper. It's if a drink is missing something, it's usually one of a couple things. It's missing some bitters. It's missing acid. It's missing one of the primary components of flavors, in the same way that food, if something's off, it's missing something. It's missing a little bit of salt, or it's missing pepper. You add a little bit of salt to it, and suddenly the dish tastes right. Cocktails are the same way. If something's missing, especially in the non-alcoholic cocktail world, it's usually a dash of vinegar, or a little bit of bitters, or a little more acid. So in the same way, bitters really do evoke kind of a culinary sense to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best way to explain them, full stop. It's really wonderful it's almost a little bit meta, in that, like, when you're trying to create a cocktail bitters formulation, which I'm sure we'll get into as we begin our tasting here in a moment. But when you create that formulation, it in and of itself is a culinary practice, because you're creating this thing that is going to add balance to a cocktail. But in order to create that thing, you need to figure out all of the ingredients that are going to create a balanced flavor profile in a cocktail bitter. There are a couple of primary traditions and use cases that are all over the cocktail canon, like the aromatic and the orange that we have in front of us, as well as the Creole New Orleans style Peychaud-esque bitters that we also have here. And there's a lot of decision making that goes into that. I guess before we start jumping into the cocktail bitters, we are recording this in dry January, and there's basically a two roads diverged approach to making cocktail bitters. You can use grain neutral spirits to extract, or you can go with a different extracting agent in order to create a non-alcoholic bitters, and that's what we have here. As somebody who makes cocktail bitters using ethanol, I'm very familiar with that, but I'm really pretty alien to any other way to make them. So I wonder if you might back us into that process by talking about the decision to go no ABV, and just some of the background behind that.
Absolutely. So to kind of It is dry January. I tuned into last week's episode with Derek, which was phenomenal. To go a little bit backwards into our story and where we got here. My wife and I, I don't want to characterize everybody this way because it's not the case, but the restaurant industry, the hospitality industry absolutely does promote or encourage, or it's chicken before the egg. Does it breed it, or does it attract over drinkers? I'm not sure. I think it's both, but there is a drinking culture, obviously, in restaurants. And my wife and I were both predisposed to over drinking. We found restaurants probably because there was a drinking culture, not just that. There's a sense of community. There's the drinks after work aren't just your typical 5 p.m. happy hour. It's you've been at war for 10 hours with 15 other people, and you get off and you need release. You need to talk about your day. You need to talk about your guests. You need to talk about the good and the bad. And doing that over 1, 2, 6 drinks is usually the preferred method of finishing a shift. So we were both drawn to that pretty heavily. After having our first child, we decided that drinking was no longer in our plan. It did not suit us anymore. We tried, about 5 or 6 months of having a little baby and continuing to live the way that we were. And it was pretty apparent that was not going to continue working for us. And so we both sought help. We both decided to quit drinking, and we did that together. Quitting drinking is difficult for anybody. People who are going through, what are we, halfway through now, almost dry January, especially, of course, if you're an over drinker. It's not, you often need medical assistance to quit drinking. That's how difficult it is. So it's a challenge, to say the least. But as folks who were completely obsessed with beverage, both for the intoxicating effects, but also for the flavor of it, we both became sommeliers. We both got into wine because we loved the flavor, the story, the ritual, the connection, everything about it, aside from the ethanol, aside from the intoxicating effects. It was a huge loss for us. It was a huge loss for our ritual, for our daily lives, our connections with other people. Of course, we were just before the pandemic. So, of course, a few months into not drinking, now we're also totally isolated. And we don't even have that option if we wanted it. So there was a huge gap. There was a huge void in our lives by not being able to enjoy the drinks that we used to love so much. Discovering that the non-alcoholic beverage world had evolved considerably since O'Doul's, which as a beverage and bar manager, like many, I refused to stock or put on the cocktail list, put on the beer list. If somebody ordered an O'Doul's, I would begrudgingly walk down the street and purchase a 6-pack from the liquor store and walk it back because I couldn't be bothered to order it through my normal liquor reps, which is insane, but that's a whole other story. That was all I knew of non-alcoholic beverages. So about 6 months into not drinking, we tasted a non-alcoholic IPA, and were blown away that, first of all, this exists. You mean I can have an IPA, I can have a pale ale, I can have a stout. It's not just one option anymore. And they were good. They were really good. And that feeling, that flavor came rushing back, that I can still enjoy these flavors the way I used to. And it was almost better in a sense because I was just drinking them for the flavor of it. And I knew that I wasn't reaching for it because I just wanted to get drunk, which is what I was doing before. I was reaching for it for the flavor of it and the enjoyment of it. And I was able to sit and really pick apart the flavors without the muddling, effects, the foggy effects of alcohol. So that led into discovering non-alcoholic spirits. Again, oxymoron. What do you mean there's non-alcoholic gin? That doesn't make any sense. In the same way that a veggie burger doesn't make any sense. But now, of course, it does. And you can find it on any menu across the country. So we built a bar. We stocked 50 something bottles of non-alcoholic spirits in our bar, and was having so much fun making classic cocktails, reinventing cocktails, totally blown away by what we could make that was alcohol free. But the one thing that really seemed to be missing was a fully alcohol free cocktail bitter. Then, of course, there are a couple options out there, but there was nothing that for us really truly felt classic. I was looking at these ranges of spirits. Lyre's, for instance, makes 18 different spirits now. Absinthe, non-alcoholic absinthe. Again, doesn't make any sense, but it's delicious. And it works well in cocktails like a Sazerac. The one thing that was missing was bitters. And so we are personally okay with using alcoholic bitters in our cocktails. We've got bottles of Angostura and Peychauds and Regans, but not everybody is. There's a lot of non-drinkers that don't want to add a few dashes of 40% straight hard liquor to their non-alcoholic cocktail. Of course, it's not going to get you drunk. You can't get drunk off 3 dashes of bitters, but that's not the point. There are plenty of people who are totally uncomfortable with having even just that bottle in their liquor cabinet. They don't want the temptation of having a 5-ounce bottle of booze in their liquor cabinet. So I realized there were so many people out there that weren't able to fully complete the experience of making an old fashioned or a Manhattan because they didn't have the ingredients. I also, during the pandemic, everybody made sourdough. My sourdough moment was herbs. It was getting into botany and herbalism and healing medicinal herbs. And home fermenting, non-alcoholic sodas, things like that. So I had gotten really into all these plants anyway. So about a little over a year ago, I decided I wanted to play around with making bitters. I wasn't comfortable having a bottle of Everclear or a bottle of overproof rum in the house. A bottle of bitters is one thing, but a full handle of overproof rum is not something that I can keep in my house. So I said, I want to make bitters, but I can't make them alcoholic. I'm going to try making them non-alcoholic, alcohol-free. So I started playing around and was shocked by how good the first batch turned out. I kind of just threw stuff together. I had done some research and some reading on how to make bitters at home, on classic styles and ingredients. And I threw something together and it was really good. So we are making our bitters with vegetable glycerin, which is really one of kind of 3 main solvents that you could use to make bitters. High proof alcohol, of course, is the number one, is the most common. Glycerin is the second. And the third is vinegar, apple cider vinegar, which works in terms of extracting flavors in the same way that water works. You make tea, you make coffee with water, obviously. Vinegar works kind of the same way, but not as well in terms of the overall final flavor profile, because overwhelmingly what you're going to taste is vinegar. But it does work in terms of pulling out some of those flavors. So what we ended up settling on was a mix of glycerin, water, and apple cider vinegar. And so at the end of the day, the vinegar that we use isn't there for flavor. It's, going back to the culinary sense, it's there to add a little bit of pop to the bitters. It's there to balance out the syrupiness and the natural sweetness that glycerin has on its own. It's there to brighten the flavors in the same way that if you squeeze lemon on broccoli or fish, it simply enhances those flavors. Adding a little bit of apple cider vinegar to our bitters simply enhances the flavors. It's not something you can taste, but it makes the flavors pop and shine through a little more.
Mm. Getting a little bit more into some of those extracting agents, it seems to me that, yes, obviously vinegar is effective at extracting flavor. Vinegar is also pretty volatile in terms of its ability to, give off aroma and kind of, leach some of the stuff that it extracts into the air. So from a preservation standpoint, not all that much better than water. And then, what you get in terms of the primary complaint against glycerin as an extracting agent from a flavor standpoint, of course, is that slight sweetness maybe a slight textural complaint too, depending on who you're talking to. And it seems like that marriage of the ACV and the glycerin, it sort of cancels out both of those weaknesses, and, they kind of prop each other up in that respect. So really, really interesting to hear the logic and the rationale behind that. And I love that you mentioned the sort of medicinal backgrounds, because bitters were medicine. Why do you need a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down? Because the medicine is bitter, because the medicine is bitters, or at least it was back in the 1800s when these products were first kind of walked into the cocktail world. And if you do, like I have, and many of our listeners have, the research on the history of the cocktail, of course, it has a really medicinal history. It was a restorative, often drunk in the morning. The whole cocktail etymology, I've gone over it so many times on the podcast that it doesn't bear repeating here. But, I don't think it's possible to have a good conversation about bitters without having also the medicinal aspects brought out. So hopefully, as we taste through these flavors that you've sent along, you can maybe comment a little bit on some of the, not just the flavor use cases, but also some of the reported wellness use cases for some of the ingredients that you've used as well. But I think this would be a great time to taste one.
Absolutely.
So why don't you walk me through what I'm going to taste here?
Yeah, sure. So the first aromatic is kind of our nod. It's inspired by Angostura. This is the staple of the bar cart. If you're to stock one bitter, Angostura is always going to be it. And so, why we settled on these three flavors to start with was the idea, again, going back to wanting to really complete that non-alcoholic bar cart, what was missing from the space. And what was missing, we felt like, were these classic flavors of bitters, where you didn't have to guess as to what do I need to use in this recipe. We wanted to make it really clear. If you're making an old fashioned or a Manhattan, you would use Angostura. So you're going to use our aromatic bitters. So aromatic is inspired by those same flavors. The primary flavoring agents are cinnamon, clove, nutmeg, allspice, those baking spices that you're going to taste in Angostura. We use a host of different bitter roots and herbs. And as you touched on earlier, the primary complaint with using glycerin, and really one of the things that I hope we're able to do, glycerin has a bad rap. Anybody that makes bitters, anybody who bartends, anybody who knows cocktails, glycerin-based bitters tend to get talked down on a little bit for the reasons you mentioned. It's syrupy, it's sweet. How do you justify using something that's sweet to make something that you're calling bitters? From a practical standpoint, it's one of the only things that you could use to make non-alcoholic bitters. So the challenge was, how do we overcome the sweetness? How do we overcome the syrupiness? And if you just tasted it straight, they're syrupy. They are. These are glycerin based. These are mostly glycerin. Once it's added to a cocktail, make a bitters and soda, you use 3 milliliters of bitters in an old fashioned, that syrupy flavor, that syrupy texture doesn't come through at all. You're diluting it so much in the rest of the liquid that syrup is gone. If anything, in a non-alcoholic cocktail, which can often use a little more body, that glycerin, that syrup, is actually benefiting the drink. You actually are adding a slight amount of viscosity. Again, not overly noticeable. It's not something that's going to turn people off. Like, don't drink straight glycerin. If you were to make a non-alcoholic spirit that was primarily glycerin based, it would be kind of weird. But bitters you're using in such a small amount that it's not offensive. And if anything, it is adding a slight amount of texture and body and mouthfeel to the overall drink. The other challenge, which is a huge challenge, is glycerin is super, super sweet. There's no sugar. It's not, you don't like making traditional bitters. You don't have to cut it. You don't have to add anything to it. It has enough balancing sweetness on its own. But the challenge is, how do you overcome that massive amount of sweetness? And so what we've done, we found that we just used an absolute ton of herbs. We used a ton of raw botanical. So if you look at recipes for bitters, if you look at recipes for classic alcoholic bitters, we're probably using 2 to 3 times more raw ingredient than you would in alcohol, simply by necessity, because we kind of have to. You don't need to use as much in alcoholic bitters. I'm not saying that as a negative or as a criticism for alcoholic bitters, but alcohol is a much better solvent than glycerin is. You extract much more flavor with alcohol than you do with glycerin. You could use a teaspoon of gentian root in alcoholic bitters, whereas you might need to use, an ounce. You need to use 15 times the amount of gentian in a non-alcoholic bitter to get the same flavor. And so that's what we've done. We've packed it with an absolutely insane amount of herbs, spices, roots, fruit, citrus peels, everything, to counteract the sweet flavor of glycerin, and to pack enough flavor to get enough extraction out of glycerin, which is not as good a solvent, to get the same intensity of flavor that you would find in alcoholic bitters. And again, apple cider vinegar just kind of rounds that equation out a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. A lovely aromatic bitter flavor profile. I immediately got sort of like, the baking spice, of course, the allspice cinnamon and clove trio comes out, which is also something you get from Ango. And then as you were kind of describing the multifaceted bittering profile here, I mean, man, you really went for it. So with our bitters, my rationale for using a single bittering agent, which is gentian, which you were just mentioning, is because, I really wanted that to be our constant, our K. You in California, you got a lot of good produce for a good portion of the year. We on the East Coast maybe don't have as much stuff right in our local area all the time. So when I'm getting oranges, sometimes they're from Florida, sometimes they're from California, sometimes they're from Texas. There's some ingredient discrepancies in terms of, the quality. And so I like to make our bittering agent as a separate extract and then dope that in to make sure that at the end I have a constant flavor profile, even if there are some ingredient quality fluctuations that I'm dealing with on the front end. Now, with this, you've got dandelion root bittering agent, gentian root bittering agent, burdock root, milk thistle seed. That's 4 right there. Yellow dock root, is that also a bittering agent? So that's 5.
Yellow dock is bitter. It's bitter and sour. Yellow dock is a really, really interesting flavor. That it adds a lot of different components to it.
That's intense. How hard was it to balance all of that out? Because my another reason why I selected gentian as our sole bittering agent is because I view bittering agents as almost like a plot arc, I guess you might say. Is like there's some that are very mildly bitter, and fairly flavorful, like, for example, hops would be very flavorful, pretty bitter, but you can go way up from there. And then as you kind of head up the plot arc and things get more interesting, you've got something like the quinine, and then all of the even more bitter quinines like quassia. And then you get to the peak, which is gentian, which is the most bitter, but it really doesn't have any other flavors. It's just bitter. And then as you start going down the other side, you have other really bitter, intense things like wormwood, for example, which is very bitter, but also has sort of those metallic, earthy notes to it. You've got like other things you use in Amaro, like the artichoke and cardoon, stuff like that, where it gets even kind of funkier and earthier. So how do you balance 5 different bittering agents in a single bottle?
It took a lot of trial and error. Like I said, we started with that first batch where I threw stuff together. I went outside and I picked dandelions and I threw dandelions in there. I don't know, because I thought it would be a good idea. That batch was fun to make, but it wasn't. It was way far off from where we needed to go. So we settled on the primary flavors. We settled on the flavor profile that we were looking for, because first and foremost, we want these to be cocktail bitters. We want these to evoke the classic flavors of cocktail bitters. But we also, as kind of part of our directive in creating this, I wanted to tie it back into medicine. I wanted to harken back to the 1800s use of bitters as a daily tonic. Bitters were taken, and most people I think are familiar with this, but bitters were taken as a tonic. They were taken for digestion. They were taken for everything, for malaria, for back pains and jaundice and erectile dysfunction and all kinds of crazy things that may or may not have actually worked.
It was your
more often than not.
Before multivitamins.
Exactly. Which is, of course, where the use of bitters in cocktails came from, was that the bitters tasted terrible. And so you mix them into a spirit with sugar and water, and so that you could get the medicine down, of course. So we wanted to bring it back to that medicinal era, while at the same time tying it with the classic flavors that bitters eventually evolved into. Bitters went from primarily being medicine to eventually being primarily for flavor for use in cocktails. Cocktail bitters still, of course, have a medicinal value. Anything bitter is going to aid digestion. Any cocktail bitter on the market is going to have some level of medicinal value. But we've grown away from the primary focus of bitters being medicine, and they're now more for flavor. We wanted to bring those two together. And so that's, first of all, kind of where the idea to include herbs like dandelion and burdock and yellow dock root came from, because they have an incredible medicinal value in terms of digestion, in terms of detoxification, of cleaning your blood, of cleansing your liver. That's where things like milk thistle seed came from. So the idea kind of came around at the same time. We figured if we were making bitters that were specifically going to be used in non-alcoholic cocktails, as well as regular, you can use this in a classic old fashioned if you want. You can use it in anything. But for the most part, these are going to be used in alcohol-free cocktails. And people who are quitting drinking for whatever reason, whether it's 1 month out of the year or 9 months or a week or forever, have some interest in their health. You're quitting drinking for either your physical health, your mental health, your well-being. There's some aspect of health tied into the reasoning behind taking a break or quitting drinking. So we figured if we could tie these into health, why not? If we could give these a medicinal function, a health benefit, then why not? If you're going to be drinking bitters and soda throughout the day or making a cocktail at night, why not get a little bit of extra functional benefit in there as well? So that's kind of where the idea for those ingredients that are a little more esoteric than just gentian came from. We got it right by making it hundreds of times, by starting with a base recipe and tasting it side by side with Angostura, Peychaud's, Reagan's Orange, saying, okay, here's what works, here's what doesn't, and then making it again 20 times and tweaking one ingredient slightly, increasing dandelion a little bit, taking one ingredient out completely. I do this in cooking too, I have the problem of adding way too much of everything. I am not a subtle chef. I use every single spice in the cabinet, and I use a lot of it. I smoked for a long time. Maybe that's where that comes from. I don't know. But I did the same thing when I started making these. I threw in everything. Each bitter had 50 ingredients. They didn't make any sense. They were convoluted and confused. And so I slowly started to pull things back a little bit and refocus on what we were doing. And then just tweaked it incrementally over and over again. And went from, say 5 pounds of cinnamon to 4 pounds of cinnamon. And it was like, okay, there we go. That's better. And of course, the bitter, balancing those bitter elements is the hardest. But one of the things that I love about our bitters so much is that they not only tie into the classic flavors, they're inspired by classic cocktail bitters, but they have their own unique flavor. And it's what, by necessity, I feel like gives these the complexity that they need, because they're at the disadvantage of being made with glycerin. It needs something else to it. Non-alcoholic cocktails benefit from having something else to it. So not only are you getting the classic flavors of cinnamon, nutmeg, whatever, but you're also getting the added complexity of 6, 7 different bittering agents. And so these have their own unique, earthy, rooty flavor to them because they're made with roots. Gentian, like you said, is the cleanest bitter. It just tastes bitter. Gentian is the most amazing flavor in the entire world. but make a cup of dandelion tea or a cup of burdock tea, and they have their own beautiful flavor to them that is kind of hard to describe unless you've tasted them. They taste like roots. They taste like earth. They're all unique. Burdock is very different from dandelion, although the two go together very often. But they each add their own voice to the overall flavor profile. So at the end of the day, it was a lot of trial and error over the last year or so.
I love imagining that process for you, because I too have done the recipe development game, and I just love imagining that process for you, beginning sort of in chaos as you were describing with the kitchen sink approach, and then as you apply not the scientific method, but the guess and check method of, stepwise manipulation of a recipe. I love imagining that chaos sort of fractalizing into clarity. And it's really, it's one of the challenging but also rewarding aspects of recipe development. Also, just want to echo your sentiment that this is not Angostura bitters. If I were to bump into this in a dark alley, I would not confuse it for Angostura, but certainly an excellent substitute for any great aromatic bitters in any of those, classic old-fashioned style cocktails. So why don't we taste the orange here, and hopefully that will give us another way to think about these flavors here, because you were mentioning before we recorded that this was quite a bit different than the aromatic flavor profile.
It is. And so the orange was again, it's its own unique flavor, but was absolutely inspired by orange bitters like Reagan's specifically. I wanted to look at the bitter that really put orange bitters in the public spotlight and really reinvented the category of bitters in itself. I felt like if we're going to pay homage to any orange bitter, it should probably be Reagan's. And so we focused more on flavors like cardamom and coriander specifically. Coriander, I realized as we were developing this, does an incredible job of highlighting orange flavor. Coriander, I'm almost embarrassed to say this. I didn't realize until I started this how citrusy coriander is. And when you taste it on its own, it tastes a lot like oranges. And so the coriander helps to pull out some of that orange flavor, but also gives it its own herbaceous quality. Cardamom gives it a little bite. Caraway seed adds another level of intrigue to it. So it was absolutely inspired by Reagan's. But again, if you taste them side by side, certainly straight, you're definitely not going to confuse the two. But a lot of the flavor profile was inspired and pulled from bitters like Reagan's. We wanted this to be more of a savory, spicy style of bitter, as opposed to being solely orange forward. There's nothing wrong with that. There's plenty of orange bitters on the market that are just straight orange. If you want to add nothing but orange flavor, those options exist. We wanted to bring in that bright orange flavor solely through bitter orange peel, rather than adding orange extract, orange oil, any straight, orange juice type of flavors, and instead solely relying on the citrus oils. So we use dried bitter orange peel. We use dried standard orange peel. We peel fresh oranges. We use a number of different oranges to pack that flavor in there. And again, you use an absolutely ridiculous amount of orange peel on top of a ridiculous amount of gentian, burdock, ginger, all of those other components that are kind of standard across the three flavors. Those kind of wellness ingredients, the dandelion, burdock, milk thistle seed, those exist in all the flavors, both for flavor and function. Each flavor has its own, I call it a bonus ingredient. The aromatic bitters uses Holy Basil, which is an adaptogen that helps our bodies manage stress. Different adaptogens and nervines are beneficial to our body in different ways, primarily through managing stress, anxiety. They can be calming. They can help restore a fatigued body, etc. But I wanted to choose ingredients that would reflect the flavor profile of the bitter. So Holy Basil in particular tends to be pretty spicy. It kind of has a baking spice, a pepper, a citrusy quality to it, and that really fit with the aromatic profile. For the orange bitters, we used lemon balm because it adds a citrusy quality to it. It adds a little mintiness. And again, it adds an earthy herbal quality. And so we wanted these to be reminiscent of classic cocktail flavors, but to really be their own thing. And where we leaned heavily into was kind of that herbaceous, earthy quality. So the orange bitters also have that little bonus of lemon balm in there, which is nice.
Yeah, it's a wonderful product to work with, either in its dried or its fresh form. A couple observations there. We also, in our orange bitters, use dried sweet, dried bitter orange, and fresh orange peel. And it's so funny that was the light bulb moment for us when we actually finally added all three of those into the formulation. That's when it finally started tasting right. So it's really nice to hear that you also that test has been replicated and approved by a laboratory on the opposite coast. When I saw lemon balm on the ingredients, I was like, it's kind of weird. Like it does have that slightly mentholated quality. And I was like, lemon balm with orange? Like, doesn't that just taste like drinking orange juice after you brush your teeth? Like, that's like one of the worst tastes. But then as I tasted it, and as you said, one ingredient that's not on the label, I'm sure it just falls under the category of spices, but the caraway seed.
Spices, yeah.
Caraway seed has that minty quality, and then you've got the apple cider vinegar. So whereas I don't know that lemon balm might fit so well in an ethanol extract with orange for perhaps multiple different reasons, flavorfully and texturally. But here I really do see it working because, the ACV, which has that like slight acetic bitterness, really jives well with the kernely aspect of the caraway, and again the slight mintiness of both the caraway and the lemon balm. So what seemed at first to be slightly out of place actually makes a lot of sense now. What's a primary adaptogenic use of lemon balm?
Lemon balm is so there's two buzzwords of medicinal herbs right now. Adaptogen and nervine is the other one. Nervine is hops. Hops is the best example. Valerian root, catnip, lemon balm. There's a handful of others, but nervines are specifically calming. Nervines are helpful for anxiety, as opposed to adaptogens counteract and balance stress. Those sound similar, but they have slightly different functions. Anxiety versus just kind of, when I say stress, it's not like I'm stressed out because I have a paper due. It's just the natural stress that your body is under every day by being awake and alive and inhaling exhaust fumes and whatever else. Fatigue is a good example of, the stress that your body is put under. Lemon balm is a nervine, which is calming and is helpful for anxiety. It's helpful for sleep. None of these are used in, one thing that I want to make clear is that these aren't dietary supplements. This is not an herbal supplement. This is not meant to be taken in place of medicine. These are cocktail bitters. These are meant to flavor drinks with the bonus of getting a medicinal value, a functional benefit from it. We don't use enough lemon balm that it's going to put you to sleep. And even if you drank a cup of lemon balm tea, it's not going to put you to sleep. It adds to that. It adds to helping you relax. It can help you go to sleep. In addition to a proper sleep routine and proper diet and exercise. None of these things are cure-alls, like bitters were marketed as in the 1800s. They were marketed as a cure-all for everything. None of these are cure-alls, but they do absolutely enhance your life when used in addition to a proper diet and sleep and exercise and everything else.
Well, if you look at the brain and the body as a mutually reinforcing feedback loop, I think that your distinction between adaptogens and nervines and the distinction between stress and fatigue, or rather, what is it, stress and anxiety? I think that makes sense, because if, like the body has this thing called homeostasis. It is like, if you are feeling good, it's your body's way of telling you like, hey, like things are generally going well in the homeostasis category, which is, my way of trying to stay together as this entity I call Eric, or this entity I call Ian. And if they're not feeling good, then, it's saying, well, homeostasis ain't doing so well. Like I've had a long day, maybe I've been breathing in too much of that exhaust for too long, or maybe I've been, neglecting certain routines that I need. And so for me, the stress is like the literal fact that we live in an entropic universe, and it's exerting crazy forces on our body, and our body is somehow resisting those forces and building itself up from inside. And then on the flip side of things, the anxiety, I'm not saying it starts either in the brain or the body, but the primary place where we experience it is certainly cortical neural in our heads. And so it makes sense that, if you're building things back up from the body with the adaptogens, you can also sort of calm things down on, from the top down with the nervine. So I don't know if that's a useful way of looking at it.
It is. Homeostasis is a great way of looking at it. These are not only a tool for your bar, but these are a tool for your wellness and for keeping your body in check, for keeping your body in a constant place. And not only, you touched on something really interesting, adaptogens, nervines, these things that carry specific benefit. There's a connection between our brain and our gut and digestion. When you hear the term butterflies in your stomach, you're feeling nervous or you're feeling anxious because you are about to give a speech in front of 200 people, which makes your stomach feel upset. If your brain isn't functioning, your gut doesn't function well. And if your gut isn't functioning well, then your brain doesn't function well. So if there's a problem with your digestion, you're going to be stressed out because it's going to affect your brain. So not only, were we going for the specific functions of the ingredients in these bitters, but the overall general idea of, if you can impact your digestive system, if you can help your kidney, your liver, your stomach, that is going to help you manage stress in itself, because your brain isn't being, messed around by the fact that you're having some digestive issues. That's kind of overall, I think one of the most positive impacts of using something like a digestive bitter is that it's homeostasis. It regulates not only your stomach, but it regulates your entire body.
Yeah, there's like this crazy thing that like literally sticks down into your stomach called the vagus nerve, direct main line to the brain. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense why all this is connected. And it really does, I want to get onto this last bottle that we need to taste before we jump into the lightning round here. But, the thing that makes me think of is the conversation that I was having with Derek Brown about mindfulness and mindful mixology. Well, one of the other terms that really accompanies mindfulness is embodied cognition. When you're able to, get your mind into a certain space where, it's relaxed and things are going well, that has cascading effects on the body. And so, I don't want to call it my primary gripe with non-alcoholic cocktails or no ABV cocktails, but I say most often where they go wrong is that they are so focused on alcohol being the devil and exercising the devil that they leave a void where alcohol was actually doing some interesting work in the body. And so for me, I think that it's so important that if you're like, maybe not so important, but like the easiest way in my mind to create a non-alcoholic cocktail that actually approximates or does something very similar, if not better than an actual cocktail does, is to actually have it have some sort of effect on the body. It doesn't necessarily need to be like you drink it and then within 5 minutes you feel like actually like tipsy or something like that. But I want it to have some effect on my mood. I drink a cocktail because I want it to have an effect on my mood. And if you're just exercising the devil ethanol, you're not necessarily providing what that was doing in a certain manner of speaking. So I'm so glad that we were able to get into some of the granular ingredient level stuff, because I think it goes beyond just Holy Basil, and it goes just beyond, adaptogens and nervines. It goes to what a cocktail is supposed to evoke in your life. So, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that before we taste the New Orleans Creole style.
I think you nailed it. The reason why we're seeing so many of these non-alcoholic spirits come out that are focusing on adaptogens, that are focusing on functional benefits, is you need to replace some of what you've taken out. I think we're talking more and more about this space in terms of less in terms of what's missing and more in terms of what's been added, more in terms of what do you get from this. And I caution people from expecting too much from some of these spirits that are using, calming ingredients, things like that. They're not going to make you feel like alcohol. There's no replacement for ethanol. It doesn't exist. But they are going to give you a functional benefit in terms of homeostasis, in terms of balancing yourself out, in terms of making your biological makeup function better. It's not going to make you feel drunk, but it's going to help your overall system, which is important. And if we can get that with the ritual of drinking a cocktail, of the placebo, not even the placebo, but the connection of enjoying and picking apart the flavors. If you're a bartender, creating the flavors, but of sipping and sitting down and sipping a drink and being able to enjoy the company of friends with a cocktail in hand, to be able to sit for hours and talk the way that you used to over cocktails, but then drive home afterwards. If you can get some function to that, some benefit to that while you're drinking for 2 hours, why not? Why not include those healthful ingredients in these products?
Yeah, it evokes almost the hospitality and sort of emotional effects of the tea ceremony, almost, where it's like, all right,
absolutely,
it's something that you can do as an act of hospitality, as an act of ritual, and I have a contention that cocktails mean something. Especially if you're going to go through all the effort of putting ingredients together in different ratios and then transforming them with ice or with some other technique for mixing and integrating the flavors, and then putting some thought into service method. To me, that means something, and it's going to mean different things to different people, but I think at the end of the day, it does mean something. And I'm not quite sure. Like, I think that if there's one place that we can do better in the non-alcoholic cocktail space, it is figuring out, like you were kind of mentioning, how we can do better to communicate that positive use case, as opposed to making it sound like an 80s, 90s movie where it's the nerds versus the jocks. And, eventually we have to somehow get to the place where we realize that the nerds were cool all along in their own way for not imbibing alcohol. Because as a guy who drinks regular cocktails very often, I don't feel like a jock when so if I'm not getting the benefit of the power trip of picking on the nerds, then I just want to be in a non-alcoholic space where the focus is on what's being presented. And I think that's what's so compelling about what we've been tasting here today, and just the thought process that you've had for putting the flavors together. So why don't you explain how the third big style here, this New Orleans style bitters, is working? It's got some really cool color to it.
The New Orleans is so, again, inspired by Peychaud's, but is probably the furthest from the inspiration. New Orleans was absolutely the hardest one to get right. We went through months and months of going, this is so far off from tasting like anything, from resembling Peychaud's, from resembling anything that I would want to drink. This was really hard to balance these flavors. And so where we ended up kind of landing was a bitter that was Peychaud's. Let's back up for a second. Peychaud's compared to Angostura. You taste them side by side. They have different flavor components, obviously, but overall, Peychaud's is easier to taste and drink than Angostura. It's less bitter. It's fruitier. It's more fun. If you were to characterize them, I'd characterize Peychaud's as being a little more fun than Angostura. And so we kind of leaned into that angle. And our New Orleans bitters they're fruit forward. They're cherry, they're hibiscus, which has its own kind of raspberry, cranberry, floral flavor to it. Rose hips, which again add kind of a tart, fruity aspect to it. And then heavily aniseed, star anise, and fennel seed. So again, in the same way that they're very different from Peychaud's, you still get those classic notes of anise and cherry, which you're going to find in Peychaud's. So if you're to use these in a Sazerac or any other cocktail, you're going to get that aroma of anise, which is the predominant flavor in Peychaud's. That's the predominant aroma. But these are decidedly fruit forward. These are cherry, they're sour, they're bright, they're tart. These are kind of our fun bitters. These are really approachable, really easy. But again, you mix them in 12 ounces of soda water and it's not going to taste like cherry juice. It tastes like spice and anise and a hint of fruit. Once you mix it into a drink, it doesn't taste sweet. On its own, these are on the sweeter side, which is why they were a little harder to balance. One of the benefits of doing small batches, we make about 5,000 bottles at a time, completely by hand. It's Carly and I doing everything from start to finish by hand, is that we get to make tweaks along the way. And so with every new batch, we get to change things a little bit. So with the next batch that we're starting right now, we've increased the gentian root a little bit. We've increased the dandelion a little bit. We upped the apple cider vinegar a little bit to try and counteract and balance some of that inherent sweetness in this, and to give it a little more depth and complexity and roundness. But this is, out of all three, this has ended up being my favorite and what we go through hands down the most of. We've gone through 8-10 bottles of this in the last couple months. It goes in everything. It's just, at the end of the day, it's super tasty. It's easy. And it's just kind of, I just find it delicious.
So you said, was it 5,000 bottle batches?
Yeah.
So I imagine that your favorite part is the heat seals, right?
Yeah. Right now, yes. One at a time, shrink banding every single bottle by hand, stamping the bottom of every bottle with a date sticker, and physically bottling 5,000 bottles by hand without a bottling line. It takes like 2 weeks.
Oh, do you not have a bottling? Like, do you have a single fill?
No.
Do you have a single fill?
It is 2 nozzles.
Okay, I was going to say, you have some sort. You're not just like you're not eyeballing this.
No. We have equipment. We have some proper equipment. Good. But we're in this. I wish that when we had started, somebody had written a book on how to create and launch a mid-sized bitters company. Because so much of this, we had no idea what we were doing. We got our first drums of glycerin and I was pushing them physically across the kitchen because I didn't realize I needed a specific dolly to move 55-gallon drums. Obviously, that's something that exists. I thought you could just use a regular dolly. You can't. So I was physically pushing barrels across the kitchen. We now have a drum dolly. We've upgraded bottling machines from a single fill that took, for instance, 12 seconds to fill a bottle to now we have 2 nozzles that do it in 4 seconds. So we're slowly evolving as we move forward, but we're still at the scale where we don't have a bottling line. We don't have crazy high-tech equipment. We're doing everything by hand. We're making enough that we can get it out there into distribution. We've had conversations with 8 different countries that want to import our bitters. We've talked to distributors. We've talked to retailers across the country. We're making enough that we can get the product out there, but we're not big enough yet that we can move into our own space. We can't afford a bottling line yet. We don't have any employees yet. 2022, we really hope, by all indications of the response that we've had so far from the community, we hope that this is going to grow pretty quickly and that we can stop shrink banding 5,000 bottles at a time. That's like our closing side work. Like every night we put the kids down and then we do 2 hours of shrink banding. which is not sustainable. We can't do that forever, but that's where we're at right now.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I feel your pain. I feel your pain. Before we wrap up on the New Orleans style, why don't you give us a drum roll, please? Featured botanical is
Schisandra Berry.
What is Schisandra Berry?
Schisandra Berry is also called five flavor berry. I'm sorry. It is a Chinese herb. It's one of the more potent adaptogens out there. There were studies done in the 60s or 70s in the Soviet Union on hunters that found that Schisandra Berry increased night vision, decreased fatigue, did all kinds of stuff. It was used, in military trials to see what effect it would have on the body. Again, we're not using enough of it to keep you up at night. It's just enough to complement everything else and to add a little bonus of functional benefit. But Schisandra is a fascinating flavor. It's called five flavor berry because it literally contains all five flavors: salt, sweet, umami, bitter. It's a kaleidoscope of flavors that is not for everybody. If you taste it on its own, I think you're either going to fall into the camp of this is my favorite thing ever, or I can't believe you just served this to me. In addition to everything else that's in these bitters, it simply is one more voice in the chorus,
right,
that helps to balance it and helps to add unique flavor. And again, helps to make our New Orleans bitters incredibly flavorful and carry a strong flavor, which is more difficult to achieve when you're using glycerin.
And that is a spirits making move that you just described. That's how gin makers describe fixatives or binders like orris root. Of course, this doesn't taste anything like those, but when you've got other kind of fruity flavors in there, like the hibiscus, the rose hips, you've got the cherry in there, like, of course, the Schisandra Berry, different aspects of it, different of its personalities are going to latch on to the other ones and kind of pull them in for a little hug and kind of make everything a little bit more consonant. So that makes complete sense to me. Super fun, as you described. I love that all three of these have such unique personalities, and I think that you've got a hell of a lineup on your hands so far. So congrats.
Thank you so much.
Congrats on that. And it's been really exciting to taste these with the expert and the and the manual labor that produced them. So
hopefully not for too long. We'll see.
Yeah. Like I said, I feel your pain, and you can always call me if you need to vent. But
yeah,
I guess that leads me to our last question. Here's like, what is the future besides doing more and getting more efficient and getting these out to more markets? Do you have any flavors that you're planning on pursuing? Do you have any partnerships or activations or causes that you're really excited about that you're going to be working on over the next year or two?
We are. Yeah, we have. All I've been doing for the last year and a half is dreaming big. And now that we're finally here and we finally, created the base, the core lineup, we're super excited to move forward and to grow. And so we're playing with a number of additional flavors. I think now that we've gotten the core lineup down, the classic flavors, I'm really excited to move into the more fun aspect of bitters, which is the more unique flavor profiles. And so I want to continue leaning into the functional aspect of it. I think everything that we produce is going to have a benefit to it, but I'm excited to branch out into different focuses. As an example, we're playing right now with a lavender chamomile bitters, and the bittering agent, I decided not to use gentian at all in that one. Instead, I'm using a nervine called blue Vervain, which is super bitter, is grassy in the same way that wormwood. Have you tasted blue Vervain before?
I have not.
Okay, so in the same way that wormwood is grassy and earthy and herbal, in addition to being insanely bitter, blue Vervain is super, super sharp and bitter, but also carries with it the functional benefit of being a relaxant and helps with stress.
Like chamomile.
So for example, exactly. So lavender, chamomile, we're using in that one. I think I've got rose petals, rose hips, blue vervain as the bitter. So leaning into a passion flower, a number of other strong relaxants, strong nervines, but again, tying it into the flavor profile of floral, of predominantly lavender, with all these other supporting characters that add both additional complexity in terms of flavor, but also complexity in terms of the overall functional benefit to it.